Welcome back to the channel, Dreamers. I hope you are comfortable to hear more horror stories. Before you drift to sleep, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check our playlist, containing all stories compilations. Now lay down and relax. About a year and a half ago, my best friend of over 15 years and I decided to visit my family farm in Michigan after finishing our late shift at work. The farm, passed down through generations, had always been a place of comfort for me. A space to clear my head and enjoy the quiet isolation of nature. That night, the air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves mixed with the faint musk of damp soil. It was early fall, the kind of evening where you could see your breath if you stood still long enough. The sky was so clear you could pick out constellations with the naked eye, and the silence was broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl. We had pulled up in my truck and parked by the farmhouse, a structure that had stood the test of time, but bore the scars of decades of weather and use. Its wooden boards were warped and gray, the paint long since peeled away by the relentless Michigan winters. A single porch light flickered faintly, barely illuminating the gravel driveway and the surrounding yard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the darkness beyond it feel heavier, almost tangible. We grabbed a couple of chairs from the back of the truck and set them up near the edge of the field, where the open space gave us a clear view of the sky. At first, the evening was uneventful. We sipped our coffee and talked about work, complaining about the usual headaches of the job, and laughed about a few inside jokes we had collected over the years. The farm, as always, felt peaceful, a far cry from the constant noise and motion of the town. As the conversation meandered, I caught my friend looking around a few times, his eyes darting toward the shadows at the tree line. It wasn't like him to be jumpy. He was the kind of guy who could stay calm even in situations that rattled most people. But that night, he seemed distracted. At first, I thought he might just be tired from work, but then he asked a question that made the air around us feel colder. "This place has always had a strange feel to it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Almost like you're being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean." The question caught me off guard. I stopped mid-sip, lowering my coffee cup as I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He shrugged but didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on the dark outline of the woods in the distance. "I don't know," he said after a pause. "It's just, I've been here a few times with you, and it always feels the same. Like there's someone standing just out of sight, watching. It's probably nothing, but it's weird, you know?" I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease that crept into the edges of my thoughts. "You're overthinking it," I said. "It's just an old farm. If anything's watching, it's probably a deer or a raccoon." But even as I said it, I couldn't fully convince myself. His words had tapped into something I didn't want to acknowledge, a feeling I'd experienced here before but never put into words. I tried to brush it off, telling him about some of the stories my dad had shared with me about the farm's history, hoping to shift the mood. As I spoke, though, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The crickets, which had been chirping steadily when we arrived, seemed to have fallen silent. The faint rustling of leaves in the breeze had stopped too, leaving only the sound of our voices and the occasional creak of the chairs beneath us. Sitting there in the dark, the stories I had heard growing up seemed to echo louder in my mind. I'd always chalked them up to the overactive imaginations of kids, or the embellishments of adults trying to entertain. But now I wasn't so sure. Maybe the farm's history wasn't as distant as I wanted to believe. Whatever it was, it felt like we weren't as alone out there as I'd convinced myself we were. I began to tell the story, one that had been passed down in my family for decades. It started in the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, when my great-grandpa had purchased the farm. Back then, the farm wasn't just a home, it was a lifeline. Relatives from all over would come to help with the back-breaking work of maintaining the land. In return, they were allowed to hunt the property, a crucial way to put food on the table in those difficult times. One evening, my great-grandpa's cousin came by to lend a hand with the daily chores. He was young, strong, and always eager to help. After a full day's work, he asked for permission to go out hunting raccoons on the property. It wasn't an unusual request. Raccoons were abundant and a good source of food. My great-grandpa, trusting him completely, gave him the go-ahead. The cousin gathered his gear, a hunting rifle, a flashlight, and a few small supplies, and set out just after sundown. He knew the land well and had hunted it many times before. When my great-grandpa woke up the next morning, he noticed the cousin's truck still sitting in the driveway. At first, he didn't think much of it. Maybe he had decided to hunt late and sleep in the truck. But as the hours passed and the cousin didn't appear, my great-grandpa began to feel uneasy. The cousin was responsible and punctual, not the kind of man to leave without a word. As the sun began to rise, he decided to head out to the back pasture, where he knew the cousin liked to hunt. The walk to the pasture was familiar, but that morning it felt different. The air was unusually still, and the early light barely pierced the dense tree cover. My great-grandpa called out his cousin's name, his voice carrying across the empty fields. At first, there was no response, just the muffled sound of his boots crunching through the grass. Then he heard it, a faint voice, just barely audible, calling back to him. It sounded like his cousin, but something about it wasn't right. The tone was flat, almost mechanical, as if the words were being forced out. He called again, louder this time, hoping for a clearer reply. What he heard next made him stop in his tracks. The voice came again, but now it was unmistakably wrong. It mimicked his cousin's cadence, but with a guttural edge, like it was struggling to sound human. My great-grandpa later described it as a sound that didn't belong, something that sent a chill down his spine and rooted him in place. He didn't wait to find out more. Trusting his instincts, he turned and walked briskly back toward the house, his heart pounding with every step. By the time he reached the house, the sun was fully up, and he knew he couldn't leave it at that. Gathering a group of relatives and farmhands, he explained what had happened and organized a search. They spread out across the pasture and into the wooded areas, calling the cousin's name and looking for any sign of him. It wasn't long before they started finding clues, small, unsettling pieces of the puzzle. The first thing they found was the cousin's hat, lying near the edge of the swamp that bordered the pasture. It was stained with a brownish substance that none of them could immediately identify. Not far from the hat, they found his rifle. It was still loaded, with no signs that it had been fired. This detail struck them as particularly odd. If he had encountered a dangerous animal, he would have fired at least one shot. Beyond these items, there was nothing. No tracks, no further belongings, and most chillingly, no body. The group searched until sundown, combing through the fields and the swampy areas with growing desperation. But the cousin had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and an uneasy sense that something was terribly wrong. Over the years, the story became part of the farm's history, a mystery that remained unsolved despite my great-grandpa's relentless efforts to find answers. Even decades later, he continued to hold out hope, always watching for signs that might explain what happened that night. After that fateful day, the disappearance of my great-grandpa's cousin became an open wound in the family, one that never fully healed. For months, and even years, my great-grandpa led search efforts whenever he could. He coordinated with local farmers, hunters, and even authorities, though their resources were limited, and interest in the case eventually waned. The swampy areas of the pasture were combed through repeatedly, but the dense mud and shifting water made it nearly impossible to search thoroughly. The family even drained parts of the swamp during a particularly dry season, hoping to find anything, a bone, a piece of clothing, anything that could provide closure. But nothing ever turned up. The items that were found during the initial search, the loaded rifle, the hat with the strange brown spatter, were kept in the family, almost as relics of the unresolved tragedy. My great-grandpa had the rifle cleaned and stored away, but he never touched it again. The hat sat in a box with other odds and ends from that time, always there but never spoken of unless someone asked directly. The brown substance was never identified, though my great-grandpa suspected it wasn't blood, as it didn't dry or flake the way blood usually did. Despite these small details, the lack of a body or any concrete evidence left everyone with only speculation. My great-grandpa became increasingly obsessed with the disappearance as the years went by. He would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring out the window toward the pasture, as if expecting his cousin to walk out of the woods at any moment. He told my dad once that he couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself held the answer, that something about the property wasn't right. He spoke less and less about the voice he had heard that morning, only saying that it wasn't normal and refusing to elaborate further. Whatever he had experienced left a lasting impression, one that he carried to his grave. The mystery became a part of the farm's identity, a story whispered at family gatherings and passed down through generations. Everyone had their theories. Some thought the cousin had fallen victim to a wild animal, though no evidence of an attack was ever found. Others speculated that he had stumbled into a patch of quicksand or been dragged into the swamp by its thick mud. But none of these explanations accounted for the eerie details, the voice my great-grandpa heard, or the fact that the rifle hadn't been fired. It was as if the land had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. Even decades later, the disappearance cast a long shadow over the farm. My dad told me about how, as a child, he was always warned not to wander too far into the pasture, especially near the swamp. He and his siblings avoided the area altogether, not out of fear of wild animals, but because of the stories that clung to it. There was always a sense that the land was holding back secrets, that it had taken something and would never give it back. The only time my great-grandpa seemed to find hope was during a drought in the 1960s when the swamp dried up significantly, revealing parts of the land that hadn't been visible in decades. For weeks, he searched the dried-up bed, turning over every rock and sifting through the thick mud. He found a few old tools and rusted pieces of equipment long forgotten, but nothing that could explain what had happened all those years ago. The disappointment weighed heavily on him, but even after that, he never stopped watching the pasture, as if he was waiting for an answer that would never come. To this day, the story remains unresolved, an unsettling piece of family lore. The farm carries an air of quiet unease, especially at night. Sitting out there with my best friend that evening, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The land, though peaceful on the surface, seemed to hold on to the past in ways that were hard to explain. Its silence more like a presence than an absence. A few years ago, I was living in South Korea, working as an English tutor for high school students. It wasn't unusual for my lessons to stretch into the late evening, especially with students preparing for their big exams. One night, I was finishing up a session with one of my regular students, a teenage boy, when I realized how late it had gotten. The buses had already stopped running for the night, and he lived too far away to walk home safely. He hesitated for a moment, then asked me if he could stay at my place and catch the first bus in the morning. The question caught me completely off guard. Letting a male teenage student stay over? It sounded like a terrible idea, and I instinctively wanted to say no. But he looked genuinely anxious, and I could tell he didn't have many options. He kept explaining his situation, saying he had no one to call for a ride and wasn't sure what else to do. I stood there torn. The whole situation felt inappropriate, but at the same time, I couldn't see how sending him out into the cold night with no way to get home was any better. After a few minutes of back and forth, I reluctantly agreed, setting clear boundaries. He could sleep on the floor, and I'd stay in my bed. It wasn't ideal, but it felt like the most practical solution at the time. As we walked back to my apartment, I tried to ignore the knot of unease in my stomach, telling myself it would only be a few hours. He seemed genuinely relieved and kept thanking me, which helped calm my nerves a little. When we got to my apartment, I realized how cramped it was. It was a typical one-room studio, small, efficient, and designed for a single person. My bed took up most of the space, leaving just a narrow strip of floor by the door. I grabbed an extra blanket and pillow for him and laid them out on the floor. He seemed fine with it, and after a quick thank you and good night, he laid down while I climbed into bed. I tried to relax, but the situation still felt strange. I couldn't help but feel awkward about having someone else in my space, especially a teenage boy. My mind kept racing, running through all the possible scenarios of how this could go wrong. What if someone found out? What if it made its way back to his parents or my employer? Even though it was innocent, the optics of the situation weren't great. To make things worse, my apartment wasn't the most secure. The door had one of those older style locks that always felt flimsy, and the window next to the bed didn't seal properly, letting in the occasional cold draft. I had lived there for a while without any issues, but that night, I noticed every creak and groan of the building. I told myself I was being paranoid, but it felt like the walls were closer than usual, the silence heavier. As I lay there, I could hear him shifting around on the floor, probably trying to get comfortable. I figured he was just as awkward about the situation as I was, which gave me some comfort. At least I wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. Eventually, the sounds of his movements slowed, and his breathing evened out. He had fallen asleep, but I stayed awake for a while longer, staring at the ceiling and willing myself to relax. It took me a long time to drift off, but I finally did. The room was quiet, the night outside still. For a few hours, everything was peaceful, just as I had hoped it would be. But what happened next completely shattered any sense of calm I had managed to find. I woke up to my student shaking my shoulder lightly, whispering my name. I blinked a few times, trying to orient myself. It was dark except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. "I'm really hungry," he said quietly, crouched next to my bed. I reached for my phone to check the time. 2 a.m. What? I muttered, still groggy. Hungry? It's 2 in the morning. Go back to sleep. My voice was firmer than I intended, but I couldn't wrap my head around why he would wake me up for something so trivial. The room was still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I can't sleep, he replied. Please, let's go get something to eat. His voice was low but insistent. I pointed toward the small kitchenette across the room and said, There's ramen in the cabinet. You can make some if you're really that hungry. I expected him to accept the suggestion, but instead he shook his head. No, I don't want ramen, he said, glancing toward the door. There's a place down the road that's open all night. Let's go there. His persistence started to irritate me. I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. It's the middle of the night, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It's cold outside, and I'm not leaving the apartment for food. Just eat what's here or go back to sleep. But he didn't drop it. Please, he said again, his tone more urgent now. I really don't want to stay here. He was fidgeting, glancing around the room, and I could tell he wasn't just being stubborn. Something was bothering him. His behavior didn't make sense, and his insistence on leaving started to make me uneasy. I sighed, trying to stay patient. Why do you need to leave so badly? I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. He didn't answer right away, just looked at the door again and shifted uncomfortably on his feet. I just can't stay here, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. The way he said it made me pause. He wasn't acting like a typical teenager trying to get his way. He seemed genuinely unsettled. I watched him for a moment, debating whether to press him for more details or just give in. I was exhausted, and his urgency was starting to wear me down. Finally, I relented. Fine, I said, throwing off the blanket and standing up. Let's go, but we're coming right back. I grabbed my jacket and slipped on some shoes, all the while watching him. He seemed relieved that I had agreed, but still tense, like he was trying to mask how nervous he really was. As we left the apartment, I noticed he was walking quickly, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. Something about his behavior put me on edge, but I chalked it up to the awkwardness of the situation. I had no idea that his insistence on leaving had nothing to do with hunger. Once we were outside, the cold night air hit me, sharp and biting against my skin. We hadn't gone far when my student stopped abruptly and turned to me, his face pale and serious. I'm not hungry, he said in a low, quiet voice, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. I stared at him, confused. Before I could ask what he meant, he continued. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there. For a moment, I couldn't process what he had just said. My body felt frozen, my mind racing to catch up. What are you talking about? I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. A man under my bed? Are you joking? But his expression didn't change. He wasn't joking, he was deadly serious. I saw him, he insisted. I wasn't sure at first, but I looked again. He's there. That's why I had to get you out. His words sank in slowly, and as they did, a wave of fear spread through me. My apartment was small, a single room where every corner was visible except for the area under the bed. The thought that someone could have been there, hiding just a few feet from where I had been sleeping, made my stomach churn. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. You're sure? I asked, hoping against hope that he had been mistaken. He nodded, his face still tense. I didn't want to scare you while we were in there, he said, but I knew we had to leave. I couldn't think clearly. My first instinct was to call the police, but the idea of going back into the apartment to get my phone, which was still on the nightstand, made my skin crawl. What if he was still in there? What if he heard us leave and was waiting for us to come back? The quiet street around us suddenly felt too exposed, as if the man under my bed could be watching us right now. After a moment of hesitation, I decided we needed help. I told my student to stay with me, and we quickly made our way to the nearest convenience store, which was thankfully just down the road. The bright fluorescent lights inside felt like a refuge as we explained the situation to the clerk and asked to use the phone to call the police. The wait for the officers felt agonizingly long, every passing minute filled with the gnawing thought of what, or who, might still be in my apartment. My student stayed close to me, his earlier urgency replaced by quiet nervousness. When the officers finally arrived, we led them back to the building, my heart pounding with every step. They instructed us to wait outside while they entered the apartment. I stood there on the street, clutching my jacket tightly around me, feeling completely exposed. The minutes felt endless. I kept looking up at the windows of my apartment, half expecting to see movement or a shadow that confirmed my worst fears. Finally, the officers returned. Their expressions were serious, and they confirmed what my student had seen. A man had been under my bed, and not just that night, he had been living there for some time. They found signs that he had been sneaking in and out, using my apartment when I wasn't home. The idea of someone invading my private space, sleeping just a few feet away from me for weeks without my knowledge, sent a chill through me that I still haven't fully shaken. The man was taken into custody without incident, but the officers couldn't say how long he had been there or what his intentions might have been. All I could do was replay the past few weeks in my mind, trying to figure out how I hadn't noticed anything. Even now, I can't help but wonder what could have happened if my student hadn't woken up that night, or if I had ignored his insistence to leave. Mornings in our house were always predictable. My dad left the house at 5 a.m. sharp, long before anyone else. My mom would take my youngest brother to preschool, usually around 7:15, while my older siblings, rushing out to catch their bus, left shortly after. By 7:30, the house was usually empty except for me. Being in elementary school, I had the luxury of leaving later, giving me the house to myself for about 30 minutes every day. I was used to the stillness of the empty house. By the time my mom's car pulled out of the driveway, the energy of the morning chaos faded, leaving behind a quiet calm. I'd eat the last bites of my breakfast, double-check my backpack, and leave shortly after. That morning was no different, or at least, that's how it seemed at first. I grabbed my things, locked the front door behind me, and started my walk to school. The streets were empty, as usual, with most of the neighborhood kids already on their way. The crisp air and faint sound of birds chirping made the morning feel peaceful, ordinary. I had walked about a block and a half when I suddenly remembered my math book. My teacher was notoriously strict, and not having it would mean trouble. Frustrated with myself, I turned back. As I retraced my steps, I thought about how quickly I could get in and out of the house. I had only been gone a few minutes, so there wasn't much to worry about. When I reached the front door, everything looked just as I had left it. The house was quiet, the yard empty, nothing seemed out of place. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, fully expecting to grab my book and leave. But the moment I closed the door behind me, I noticed something felt off. The air inside the house felt heavier than it had before, and the silence wasn't the same comforting quiet I was used to. I paused, standing in the entryway, trying to figure out what was making me uneasy. The house wasn't supposed to feel any different. It had only been a few minutes since I left. But as I stood there, the unsettling stillness pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My plan to quickly grab my book suddenly felt less simple, and I hesitated, wondering if I should just leave without it. I convinced myself it was my imagination and started toward the stairs. That's when I heard it, a faint noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the soft, muffled sound of music. I froze mid-step, my mind racing to make sense of it. No one was home, and I knew for a fact that the stereo hadn't been on when I left. My stomach dropped. The stereo was in my parents' bedroom, a room that was always locked when they left in the morning. My mom and dad had installed a deadbolt on their door to keep one of my brothers, who had a history of stealing, from taking things. I knew it had been locked earlier, so how was it open now? Standing there in the stillness, I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe someone had come home. Maybe I'd misremembered. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. The realization that something was wrong began to settle in, but I couldn't yet bring myself to face what it might mean. The longer I stood there, the more the unease grew, yet I found myself taking cautious steps toward the stairs, unable to leave without checking further. As I moved further into the house, the unsettling feeling only grew. My parents' bedroom door stood wide open. That sight alone stopped me in my tracks. It didn't make sense. My parents always locked their room with a deadbolt before leaving, a habit they developed after one of my brothers had started taking things. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe they had forgotten for some reason, but it didn't add up. I knew I had seen it locked before I left just a few minutes earlier. Then, I noticed the stereo inside their room was on, quietly playing music. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to be heard clearly in the stillness of the house. My heart began to race. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the open doorway, trying to process what I was seeing and hearing. No one had been home when I left, so how was their room open? And why was the stereo on? Gathering my courage, I took a few cautious steps closer. The door leading to the second-story porch, which was connected to their bedroom, was also ajar. This was unusual too. It was never left open, especially in the mornings. I peered out onto the porch, but there was no one there. The gentle breeze from outside barely moved the curtain hanging in the doorway. The room itself looked untouched, but the open doors and the faint music felt like a deliberate disturbance, as if someone had been there and left in a hurry. Then I noticed something even more alarming. The attic door at the end of the hallway was open. That door was never open. It always stayed shut because the attic was mostly unused, a dusty, dark space we rarely ventured into. Seeing it ajar sent a chill through me. The narrow staircase leading up into the attic loomed in the dim light, its shadow stretching into the hallway. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave the house, but curiosity and fear kept me rooted in place. I took a tentative step toward the attic doorway, craning my neck to look inside. That's when I saw our dog. She was standing halfway up the stairs, her small body rigid and trembling. Her teeth were bared, something she never did, and she was growling softly, almost a low rumble in her throat. This wasn't normal behavior for her. She was usually sweet and timid, the kind of dog that never barked or showed aggression. But now, she was completely fixated on something at the top of the attic stairs. I crept closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. The attic staircase was narrow, leading into a space that was mostly shadows. I couldn't see what had her attention, but her reaction made me more afraid than I wanted to admit. I called her name softly, trying not to startle her, but she didn't budge. Her growling didn't stop, and her body remained stiff, as if she was trying to warn me about something I couldn't see. As I reached the base of the stairs, I was hit by an awful smell. It was thick and cloying, like something rotten or decaying. It reminded me of the scent that clings to the bottom of a garbage can that hasn't been cleaned in months. The smell made my stomach turn, and I instinctively covered my nose. There were no open windows in the attic, no reason for a breeze to be coming through, yet I felt a faint, chilling draft. I took another step forward, now close enough to grab my dog. As I reached for her, my eyes scanned the top of the stairs. That's when I saw it, a dark shape in the corner of the attic, a blob of shadows that seemed slightly out of place. I froze, my hand hovering just above the dog. The shape wasn't moving, but something about it felt wrong, as if it were watching me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a pile of boxes casting strange shadows, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. With shaking hands, I grabbed the dog and pulled her into my arms. As I turned to head back down the stairs, I glanced up one last time. The dark shape had shifted. It wasn't much, just a subtle change, as if it had leaned forward or tilted slightly, but it was enough to send me into full panic. Clutching my trembling dog, I bolted down the attic stairs, slammed the door shut behind me, and didn't stop until I was on the first floor, my heart pounding harder than it ever had before. After slamming the attic door shut, I ran down to the first floor as fast as I could, still clutching the dog. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the front porch. The cool morning air hit me, but it did little to calm the rising panic inside me. I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see something, or someone, looking out at me from one of the windows. But the house was still, eerily so, as if none of what I'd just experienced had happened. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I had just seen. The open doors, the strange smell, the moving shadow. It all seemed too surreal, but the dog in my arms was proof that it wasn't just my imagination. She was still trembling, her small body pressed tightly against me. She didn't make a sound, not even a whimper, but her wide eyes and occasional twitch of her head toward the house told me she was as unsettled as I was. I didn't know what to do. I considered going to a neighbor's house, but what could I even say? I didn't see anyone in the attic, just a shadow that moved. And who would believe that? I didn't know how to explain what I'd experienced in a way that wouldn't sound ridiculous. So I decided to walk to school, gripping my dog tightly the whole way. I would figure out what to do about the math book later, but at that moment, I just needed to put distance between me and the house. When I got to school, I left the dog with the office staff, telling them she'd followed me and that I'd take her home after school. I went through my day in a haze, barely able to focus on my classes. The image of the attic door, the dark shape, and the smell wouldn't leave my mind. I kept replaying the moment I looked up and saw the shadow move, questioning if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. But the way the dog had acted, that was harder to explain away. When I got home that afternoon, I was filled with a quiet dread. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had no choice. As I walked up to the front door, I scanned the windows, looking for any signs of movement, The house seemed perfectly normal, just like it always did. When I stepped inside, everything was exactly as it should be. The doors were closed, the stereo was off, and the faint, rotten smell was gone. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I waited for my parents to come home, half expecting them to mention the open doors or the music, but they didn't. If they had noticed anything unusual, they didn't say a word about it. I debated whether I should bring it up, but the fear of not being believed kept me quiet. Instead, I avoided being alone in the house as much as possible. For the rest of that school year, I made a new habit. As soon as my siblings left for school in the morning, I went to a friend's house nearby and waited there until it was time to walk to school together. I didn't explain why. I just told her I liked the company. At home, I avoided the attic completely, not even glancing at the door when I passed by. Looking back, I still don't know what I experienced that morning. Part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the shadow I saw and the smell I noticed could be explained away. But the unease I felt and the dog's reaction were too real to ignore. Whatever was in the attic that day, I was determined to never go looking for it again. I had decided to take a shortcut from 29 Palms, California, to Albuquerque, New Mexico. The route was a solitary stretch of two-lane road, cutting through endless desert and dotted with only the occasional abandoned building or sign of human activity. It wasn't the most inviting route, but it saved time, and I wanted to take up the challenge after friends dared me to try it. The road's desolation became apparent almost immediately. As I drove, the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, flat, barren, and void of movement. Occasionally, I'd pass a cluster of Joshua trees or patches of scrub, but for the most part, it was nothing but sun-scorched emptiness. Cell phone service was spotty, and other vehicles were few and far between. The feeling of isolation began to set in, but I told myself it was just another long drive. My first real stop along the route was Amboy, California, a nearly abandoned town in the middle of the desert. The place felt frozen in time, with weathered buildings standing as silent reminders of a busier past. Amboy had a certain reputation. People talked about strange things happening there. Some said it was linked to occult activity, but I brushed those stories off as exaggerated rumors. Still, something about the area felt unwelcoming, even in broad daylight. I pulled over to snap a picture of the city sign as proof for my friends, who hadn't believed I would take this route. Stepping out of the car, the dry desert heat hit me, and I quickly took the photo before getting back into the car. There wasn't a single person in sight, just the eerie stillness of a town that seemed long forgotten. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I couldn't help but feel relieved to be moving again. Heading out of Amboy, the road climbed into the mountains. The terrain shifted from flat salt flats and lava fields to rugged canyon walls and patches of tall grass that lined the roadside. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over the road ahead. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The landscape seemed to press in closer, and the isolation became more pronounced. At some points, I couldn't see more than a few hundred feet ahead because of the twists and turns of the canyon. The tall grass lining both sides of the road swayed gently in the breeze, but it seemed to create blind spots, adding to the tension. My senses were heightened, partly from being so alone and partly because something about this stretch of road felt inherently different. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an awareness that this wasn't the kind of place where mistakes were easily fixed. I stayed focused on the road, scanning ahead for any signs of movement or hazards. The desert's quietness wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the absence of sound itself was pressing down. Even the occasional lizard darting across the pavement or the distant call of a bird seemed amplified, reminders that I was completely alone out here. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though logic told me there was no one around for miles. As I drove deeper into the canyon, the light began to shift. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched further, creating an eerie interplay of light and dark on the road. I told myself to keep my head down, focus on the drive, and not let my mind wander into the territory of ghost stories or urban legends. But the emptiness of the surroundings and the mounting sense of unease made it hard to ignore how vulnerable I was. That's when I noticed something unusual on the road ahead. From a distance, it looked like debris or clutter. I slowed down to get a better look, not realizing this would be the beginning of one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. As I approached the clutter in the road, I instinctively slowed down to figure out what I was looking at. It was still too far away to make out all the details, but I could see enough to know something was wrong. The red Pontiac Fiero was stopped sideways across both lanes, a bizarre position for a car on a remote stretch of highway. Scattered around the vehicle were clothes and belongings spilling out of an open suitcase, as if someone had hastily emptied it. What caught my attention most, though, were the two bodies lying face down in the middle of the road, a man and a woman. They were positioned just a few feet apart, close enough that it seemed deliberate. The scene felt too staged, too unnatural. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. Something about the way everything was laid out didn't sit right with me. I stopped my car about 100 feet away, far enough to keep some distance, but close enough to try to assess the situation. My instincts were screaming at me that something was off. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement or something that might explain what I was seeing. The tall grass on either side of the road swayed slightly in the breeze, but it was dense enough to obscure anything or anyone that might be hiding there. Being a Marine, I wasn't new to situations that required quick thinking, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield or a training exercise. This was supposed to be an empty desert road. My training, however, kicked in. I reached under the seat and pulled out the 9mm pistol I always kept with me on long drives, chambering around. Holding the pistol in my lap, I took a deep breath and tried to think logically about what to do next. Getting out of the car felt unthinkable. Every fiber of my being told me that stepping out would be a mistake. The whole setup looked too perfect, too much like a trap. The scattered clothes, the car, the bodies. It felt like a horror movie, the kind where the main character ignores all the warning signs and pays the price. I kept scanning the scene, my eyes darting between the bodies and the surrounding grass, looking for any sign of movement. I debated with myself for a few moments, considering whether I should try to help or keep going. But the longer I sat there, the stronger my gut feeling became. This wasn't what it seemed. Something about the way the bodies were positioned struck me as unnatural, like they had been placed there intentionally. They weren't sprawled out or crumpled in a way that suggested an accident or attack. They were too still, too deliberate. I quickly formulated a plan. If I didn't get out of the car, I could try to maneuver around the scene without stopping. I traced a line with my eyes, passed the man on his left, swerved behind the Fiero, and avoid the woman on her right. It was tight, but it looked possible. I put the car into first gear, tightened my grip on the wheel, and took one last look around to make sure nothing was moving. As I accelerated toward the scene, my heart pounded harder with every foot I covered. I kept my eyes on the road, following the line I'd mapped out in my head. The Fiero loomed closer, and I clenched the wheel, doing my best to stick to my plan. When I passed the first body, I caught a glimpse of the man's face, pale, expressionless, and completely still. It didn't look right, but I didn't slow down to examine it further. The Fiero's back bumper was next. I swerved slightly, careful not to hit the car or the second body. My mind was racing, every instinct telling me to keep moving and not look back. I cleared the scene without hitting anything, my pulse hammering in my ears as I continued down the road. I'd made it past the obstacle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the grass. Once I was clear, I slowed down a little to catch my breath. The adrenaline had my hands shaking, and I needed a moment to process what had just happened. But before I could calm down, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. After I cleared the scene, I slowed the car slightly, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, my knuckles white, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I thought I was in the clear, but as my breathing began to steady, something compelled me to glance into the rearview mirror. What I saw made my stomach drop. The two bodies that had been lying motionless in the road were now up on their knees. Their movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if they were stretching or shaking off the stiffness from lying still for so long. Then, from both sides of the road, figures began to emerge from the tall grass. I counted at least 20 people, all stepping into the open and heading toward the car and bodies. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. These people had been there the whole time, hidden in the grass, watching me approach. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't been imagining things. This was a deliberate setup, and I had narrowly avoided whatever they had planned. The sight of those figures appearing so suddenly, so silently, left no doubt in my mind that I had been the target of an ambush. Instinctively, my right foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared as the car lurched forward, the tires gripping the asphalt. I didn't dare look back again. My focus was on the road ahead, the only thing separating me from whatever was happening behind me. The thought of stopping, even for a moment, was out of the question. The isolation of the road, which had been unsettling before, now felt suffocating. There was no one else out here, no backup, no way to call for help if something went wrong. The vast emptiness that had seemed peaceful earlier in the drive now felt like it was working against me, amplifying my vulnerability. I didn't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I was certain I didn't want to find out. I drove as fast as the road would allow, navigating the curves of the canyon with a sharpness I didn't know I had. Every turn brought a new stretch of empty road, and with each passing second, I felt a growing distance between me and the scene behind me. But the fear lingered, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to stepping out of the car, to being caught in whatever trap they had set. It wasn't until I saw the distant lights of the I-40 on-ramp that I began to feel a flicker of relief. The familiarity of the interstate, with its broader lanes and occasional traffic, felt like a lifeline. As I merged onto the highway, I allowed myself to finally ease off the gas, though my hands were still shaking as they gripped the wheel. Even as I put miles between myself and that canyon, the unease didn't leave me. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw the figures emerge from the grass, their movements deliberate and silent. I couldn't help but wonder what they had planned for me if I had stopped or gotten out of the car. I didn't have answers, but I was certain they wouldn't have been good. For the rest of the drive, I stayed alert, checking my mirrors constantly and jumping at every shadow. The thought of stopping anywhere, even for gas, was too terrifying. It wasn't until I reached a well-lit rest stop with other people around that I finally let myself pull over. Sitting there in the car, I realized just how close I had come to something I couldn't fully explain, but would never forget. Sometimes the real world can be far scarier than any story or movie. The school library was my go-to spot for late-night cramming, especially since it stayed open until 2 a.m. for students like me who procrastinated on essays until the last possible moment. That night, I had an 8 a.m. deadline for a research-heavy assignment, and I was running out of time. It was around 11 p.m. when I settled into a desk in the stacks, the basement level of the library. The stacks were quiet and isolated, which made them ideal for focusing, but also a little unnerving if you stopped to think about how empty they could get. The layout of the stacks was simple but slightly claustrophobic. The main stairs led down to a vending machine area and a long hallway. Off the hallway, there were 4 entrances to the 2 large rooms where the bookshelves and study desks were located. The tall shelves seemed to go on forever, forming narrow rows that were dimly lit by fluorescent overhead lights. The desks were positioned along the walls, making it easy to hunker down and get lost in work. When I arrived, the space was mostly empty except for one other student, a boy sitting a few desks down from me. At first, the stillness was perfect for concentrating. I had my laptop open, books scattered around me, and I was deep into my essay, only vaguely aware of the occasional shuffling noises of someone walking past or pulling a book off a shelf. By midnight, the other students who had been there earlier had packed up and left, leaving just me and the boy. As the night wore on, the quiet of the stacks started to feel heavier. The hum of the fluorescent lights became more noticeable, and every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified. I could hear the scratch of my pen on paper and the faint clicking of the boy typing on his keyboard. Despite the focus I'd initially felt, there was an underlying unease to being in such a quiet, isolated space. I tried to brush it off. It was late, I was tired, and the looming deadline wasn't helping my nerves. About 2 hours in, just as I was starting to make some real progress, the stillness was interrupted by an odd noise. At the far end of the room, I heard someone flipping through a book at an unusually fast pace, making that distinct whirp sound as the pages fanned out. At first, I thought it was just someone browsing a book, maybe trying to find a specific page. But the noise didn't stop. It kept going steady and rhythmic, like someone was doing it on purpose. I glanced at the boy, but he didn't seem to notice at first. I tried to ignore it too, hoping whoever it was would stop soon. But the sound went on for several minutes, growing increasingly irritating. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent enough to break my focus and make me feel on edge. There was no reason for someone to be flipping through pages like that, especially at this hour, in an otherwise empty room. The longer it continued, the more annoyed I became. I glanced toward the end of the room, where the noise was coming from, but couldn't see anyone through the gaps in the bookshelves. I debated whether I should go over and ask them to stop. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself, just some inconsiderate student doing who knows what. Still, the noise grated on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong. After 5 minutes of trying to ignore it, I finally gave in. I pushed my chair back and stood up, deciding to confront whoever was causing the disruption. As I started to walk toward the sound, it stopped abruptly, like someone had been watching me and waited for me to move before they stopped. I paused mid-step, scanning the rows of shelves, but there was nothing. Just silence again. Uneasy but determined to finish my work, I went back to my desk, hoping that was the end of it. But deep down, the feeling of something being off lingered. It wasn't just the noise. It was the way the silence afterward felt heavier, almost intentional. I sat back down after the noise stopped, hoping it was over for good. The silence in the room returned, but it felt different now, tense and expectant. The quiet had a weight to it, like the space was holding its breath. I tried to refocus on my essay, but my concentration was shattered. Every few seconds, I found myself glancing toward the shelves at the far end of the room, waiting to see or hear something. Not even 10 minutes passed before the flipping noise started again. This time it was louder, almost frantic, and it sounded like whoever was doing it had grabbed a much larger book. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, breaking the stillness with an almost aggressive intensity. The boy at the other desk stopped typing and looked up, his face reflecting the same irritation and unease I felt. Without a word, he stood up and started walking toward the noise, clearly just as fed up as I was. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should follow him. But when the noise didn't stop and kept getting louder, I decided to join in. We moved toward the shelves together, walking on opposite sides of the rows to cover more ground. I was on one side, and he was on the other, with the shelves separating us. The sound grew sharper, clearer, as we approached the source. It was unmistakably coming from one particular row near the back of the room. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows across the shelves as we moved closer. I glanced through the gaps in the books, trying to catch sight of whoever was making the noise, but I didn't see anyone. The rows were empty, yet the noise persisted, loud and deliberate. My heart was racing now, but I kept going, determined to figure out what was happening. We reached the end of the row, where the noise was the loudest. I stopped and waited for the boy to round the corner from the other side, expecting to find someone there. But when we looked around, there was no one. The shelves were empty, and the noise stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it had been watching us and decided to stop just as we arrived. The boy and I exchanged a confused glance. We hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the stacks, and the way the room was laid out, there was no way someone could have slipped past us unnoticed. The entrances were in full view from where we had been sitting, and the only doors out of the stacks were on the far side of the room, near us. We both stood there for a moment, scanning the shelves and looking for any clue. Nothing was out of place, no signs of movement, no books lying open, no explanation for the sound. I tried to convince myself it was something mechanical, a fan maybe, or an old air vent, but it didn't make sense. The noise wasn't constant like a machine would be, and it had been too clear, too deliberate. Still, I didn't want to let my imagination run wild, so I shrugged it off and muttered something about needing to finish my essay. The boy nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced, and we both slowly made our way back to our desks. As we walked back, the silence felt oppressive, like the room itself was watching us. Every creak of the floor and rustle of our movements seemed too loud, almost intrusive. By the time I sat down again, I felt uneasy but tried to shake it off. I told myself I was overreacting, that the late hour and the stress of my deadline were messing with my head. But as soon as we sat down, the noise started again, and this time, it was even closer. The moment we sat down, the noise returned, but now it was unmistakably close. So close that it seemed to come from right next to the boy's chair. The flipping of pages was louder and faster, like someone was furiously rifling through a massive book. He froze, his hand hovering over his keyboard, before snapping his head toward the sound. His wide eyes darted to mine, and for a moment, we both just stared at each other, unsure of what to do. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. The noise persisted, relentless and deafening, as if daring us to do something about it. His face twisted in frustration, but there was also a flicker of fear. He grabbed his bag, stuffing his laptop and books inside with hurried, jerky movements. Looking at me, he muttered under his breath, "Fuck this," and bolted for the exit without a second glance. His reaction startled me. I stayed seated for a second, torn between following him and staying to figure out what was happening. But as the noise grew louder, it felt like it was closing in on me. I could almost feel it, like a physical presence invading the space around me. My chest tightened, and a chill ran down my spine. That was all it took. I grabbed my stuff without bothering to organize it, threw it into my bag, and followed him up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The stacks were deathly quiet the moment I reached the top of the stairs, the abrupt silence making my heart race even faster. It was as if the noise had stopped the second we left the basement, as if it hadn't wanted to follow us upstairs. The sudden stillness felt wrong, like the absence of sound was more deliberate than the noise itself. I turned back to glance at the entrance to the stacks, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was just an empty, dimly lit doorway. The boy was already out the main library doors by the time I caught up to him. He didn't look back once, just disappeared into the night, as if he couldn't put enough distance between himself and whatever had been in the stacks. I stepped outside into the cool air and stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the straps of my bag. Walking back to my dorm, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. The flipping pages, the way the sound had moved closer and closer, the fact that we'd checked the shelves and found nothing, it didn't make sense. No one had entered or exited the stacks while we were down there, and the layout of the room made it impossible for someone to slip past unnoticed. The boy and I had covered every aisle during our search, and the room was completely empty. Yet, the sound had followed us, moving with a purpose that felt deliberate. When I got back to my room, I dumped my bag on the desk and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. The unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe someone hiding somewhere we hadn't seen. But the way the noise stopped and started, always timed to our movements, made that explanation feel thin. The randomness of a prank didn't match what we experienced. It felt too calculated, too targeted. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of pages flipping, loud and insistent, as if it were still chasing me. Even now, I refuse to go back into the stacks at night, no matter how urgent my work is or how many other people are there. The memory of that night stays with me, a reminder that sometimes the strangest, most unsettling things can happen in the most ordinary places. Jonathan was my mom's first child, and from all the stories I've heard, he was the kind of kid who made people smile without even trying. He had bright blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a playful energy that seemed to fill every room he walked into. He was the kind of boy who could charm his way out of trouble, like the time he accidentally repeated one of my dad's swears in church, causing more than a few heads to turn. My mom said it was impossible to be mad at him for long, because he was so genuinely sweet and innocent in his intentions. He loved being outside, riding his bike, running around the yard, and exploring the world in the way only a 5-year-old can. He had an endless curiosity that made him great at school too. Teachers adored him, not just because he was well-behaved, but because he was so engaged and excited about learning. My mom said he always came home with little stories about his day, lighting up as he recounted what he'd learned or something funny his friends had said. Despite his young age, Jonathan had a big personality. He was the kind of kid who could make friends with anyone, and he had a special bond with his best friend, Nick. The two of them lived on separate blocks, but their houses were close enough that they could stand at their respective street corners and call to each other. Since they weren't allowed to cross the street without a parent, this was their way of staying connected. But Jonathan's vibrant life took a sudden, tragic turn just a few weeks before his 6th birthday. One afternoon, he was riding his bike, as he often did, when he lost control and fell. It wasn't a dramatic accident, just a normal childhood spill. He hit his head on a rock but got up quickly, brushing it off. He told my mom he was fine, and there was no visible injury to suggest otherwise. That night, he went to bed like usual, and my mom thought nothing more of it. But the next morning, when she went to wake him up for kindergarten, she found him unresponsive. One of his pupils was dilated while the other wasn't, a sign of something seriously wrong. She called for help immediately, and within a short time, Jonathan was airlifted to the nearest hospital. Looking back, my mom said it was the kind of accident you never think could lead to something so serious. He hadn't complained of pain, hadn't seemed dizzy or confused. There was nothing to indicate that the fall had triggered something fatal. But unknown to anyone, the impact had set off a dormant brain aneurysm, a condition no one knew he had. By the time they got him to the hospital, it was already too late. The boy who had brought so much light and laughter into the family was gone in an instant, leaving a void that would be felt for years to come. While Jonathan was being rushed to the hospital, a strange and unexplainable event was unfolding at his best friend Nick's house. Nick, like Jonathan, was a young boy, full of energy and curiosity. They had been close friends for as long as they could remember, living just a block apart. Their friendship was the kind where they could spend hours together without getting bored, and they had their own system for staying in touch despite not being allowed to cross the street without a parent. From their respective street corners, they would call to each other, their voices carrying across the quiet neighborhood, setting up playdates or just chatting in the way only kids can. That morning, Nick was sitting at the breakfast table, eating cereal. The house was calm, the routine predictable. His mom was nearby, likely finishing her coffee or tidying up. Nick hadn't seen Jonathan that day, and had no reason to think anything was out of the ordinary. But as he was eating, he suddenly stopped, pushed his chair back, and got up. His mom noticed, and asked where he was going. Without hesitation, Nick replied, "Johnny's calling for me." His words were so matter-of-fact that she didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for the boys to call to each other from their corners, and maybe she assumed Jonathan's voice had carried through the open window. But as Nick walked out the door and toward their usual meeting spot, she couldn't have known the weight of what was happening. At the same time, Nick's mom received a devastating phone call from my mom. Jonathan had just been declared dead at the hospital. The fall he'd shrugged off the day before had triggered an undiagnosed brain aneurysm, and despite every effort by the doctors, there was nothing they could do. My mom, in shock and grief, was calling to let Nick's family know what had happened. As Nick's mom processed the news, she realized her son wasn't at the table anymore. Panic set in as she remembered what he had said before leaving. "Johnny's calling for me." She hurried outside, looking for him, but before she could get far, Nick came back into the house. He looked calm, unaffected, as though nothing unusual had happened. When she asked him where he had gone, Nick explained that he'd gone to the street corner because he heard Jonathan calling for him. But when he got there, Jonathan wasn't there. "He came to say goodbye," Nick said, his tone as casual as if he were describing any normal interaction with his friend. He sat back down at the table and resumed eating his cereal, seemingly unaware of the profound and unsettling nature of what he had just experienced. Nick's mom was left stunned, unable to reconcile what her son had just said with the news she had received. The timing was too perfect to ignore. Jonathan had passed away in the hospital at the very moment Nick claimed to have heard him calling. The boys' usual connection, their habit of calling to each other across their small neighborhood, had somehow transcended what anyone could explain. For Nick, it seemed like a simple farewell, a moment he didn't question or dwell on. But for the adults involved, it was a deeply unsettling and emotional event, one that left them grappling with questions they couldn't answer. My mom told me this story when I was young, and though it's about events that happened long before I was born, it has stuck with me in ways I can't fully explain. Jonathan's story isn't just part of my family's past. It feels like a shadow that lingers, influencing the way I think about life, death, and the connections we share with others. Growing up, I often thought about what it would have been like to meet him, to have him as an older brother. But his absence was always there, a quiet presence in our family's dynamic. I sometimes wonder how my mom managed to carry the weight of losing him. She spoke about him with a mixture of sadness and pride, her stories painting a picture of a sweet, curious boy whose life ended far too soon. But I also saw how deeply it affected her, even years later. When she talked about Jonathan, there was always a pause in her voice, a moment where her emotions seemed to catch up with her words. One thing that has always stuck with me is the timing of Jonathan's death and my birth. My mom had only wanted 2 children, and she made it clear that if Jonathan had lived, I wouldn't have been born. It's a strange thing to think about, that my life is, in some way, tied to his death. It's not something I talk about often, but when I do, I describe it as a kind of guilt mixed with gratitude. I wouldn't exist if he hadn't passed away, and that thought can be hard to process. As I grew older, the story of Jonathan's last moments, and Nick's experience, took on a different weight. I'm not religious, but the way Jonathan seemed to reach out to his best friend after his death feels like more than just coincidence. I've tried to rationalize it, wondering if Nick's memory of hearing Jonathan was just his way of processing grief or a child's mind trying to make sense of loss. But the timing, the detail, and the calmness with which Nick described it have always made me question that explanation. Even though I never met Jonathan, I feel a connection to him. It's not something I fully understand, but it's there, like a quiet presence in the back of my mind. Sometimes, when I think about him, it feels as though his story is a reminder to value the time we have and the people we share it with. Life can change so quickly, and the connections we have, even those that seem ordinary, can leave an impact that lingers far beyond what we might expect. Jonathan's death shaped our family, not just in the obvious ways, but in how we talk about life, loss, and love. His story has made me think more deeply about what it means to exist and how closely our lives are tied to one another, even in ways we can't fully explain. Though I'll never know him, I feel like Jonathan's presence is woven into the fabric of who I am, a quiet force that continues to influence me in ways I'm still discovering.